Welcome everybody. Appreciate you for taking your time out of your day today. We are the owners of Stone and Browning Property Management. We've begun to host these educational webinars once a month on a variety of topics that impact the Vermont housing industry. And appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to be here. Angela, appreciate you joining us. Angela Zakowski from the Vermont Apartment Owners Association is with us today. She's going to talk to us about the bill that did not pass the Senate H772, which was a major housing reform bill. There were some pretty big changes that were being proposed. So let's try this again. Where were
All
we? Let's
right.
pick it up.
Great. Thank you, Mark and Ruben, for having me on to talk about H772. So this was a very large housing bill that was introduced over in House General and Housing Committee. That was where the bill started. In Representative Mahaley's committee, Representative Mahaley was sort of the shepherd of this bill and was uh, I would say the main reason why this bill made its way through the House in the form that it was. He did a lot of really hard work on this. So if you have 2 seconds and can drop him a thank you note for that, I'm sure he would really appreciate that. But one of the things I want to sort of maybe take a step back is bills are constantly changing and evolving in the legislature. So I don't think I've ever probably shouldn't say ever because I'm sure it's happened and somebody would find it and be like, look, here's one. Very rarely do bills look the same as when they start in the process to when they come out of the process. And so all bills start in either the House or the Senate, and whichever side gets the bill first, it works through a series of committees in that uh, in that portion of the legislature. So in this case, it started in the House and it went to the House General and Housing. It was in appropriations for a little bit. The House Judiciary looked at it for a bit. And then after it goes through all those committees, and keeping in mind, each of those committees can make changes to certain parts or all of the bill, it goes to the entire floor of the House to vote on. And then we do that all over again in the Senate.
Okay.
So bills have a very long process to get through, and particularly on topics that are like housing, which people have a lot of very strong feelings about.
There was a ton of testimony this year on this one. There was a lot of
Yes,
participation.
yes, on in both the House and the Senate, and
Yeah.
lots of comments were submitted, even if people didn't get to come in and do live testimony
Yeah.
in both the House and the Senate. And so I think part of what we saw here was representatives. I'm going to focus on the House side because that's where we saw the most positive things happening. They were hearing from housing providers.
Yeah.
They were hearing from housing providers about the challenges of the process, the issues they're facing, the impacts that's having on being able to offer affordable housing, being able to offer housing to a variety of people, um, the risks that are associated with renting rental property right now. And they heard that message. Maybe not all of them, but enough of them heard that message. So what we ended up with on the House side of things was a pretty comprehensive housing reform bill that had a little bit of everything in it. Were there some things for that would be classified as for tenants to change the law to their benefit? Absolutely. Were there some things for housing providers? Absolutely. Were there some things that I think benefited both? And in many of these situations, the items benefit both parties. And this is, I think, a piece that a lot of folks miss, um, is that one, we're talking about making changes, particularly to process. The tenants who have to live next to problem tenants are also going to benefit from these changes.
Right.
So what came out of the House? We saw a bill that was going to take our current court eviction process and in almost every situation, if it was for non-payment of rent or some sort of lease violation, was going to shrink that court process to 90 days or less from
Wow.
filing. So, and I will say that time frame put us very in line with what the timing process is for an eviction in almost every surrounding state here.
The rest of the country. Yeah.
Yeah, and the rest of the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah. What's the like why aren't they able to do that now? Like how come it has to come down to passing all this regulations through a bill? Why can't and like I understand there's a lot of regulatory processes, but from a court timeline, I feel like one of the biggest holdup is just getting a date on the calendar because of court capacity.
Correct.
So even if they passed this, like would the court have capacity to meet that, or would it have required bringing in a lot of additional resources?
So I think that was one of the challenges and sort of what happened over in the Senate
Yeah.
was we saw the judiciary representatives come into the Senate and say, whoa, 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 whoa. They did that a little bit in the House, and the House was like, look, it's our role to create policy, and if our policy is telling you you need to speed up these processes, then kind of you guys have to figure that out. The Senate was a little more, whoa, the judiciary says they can't do it, so we're going to start removing things from the bill that
Right.
that speed up this process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think, realistically, would it have taken some additional personnel for the court? Possibly, but it also creates a reprioritization for them.
Mhm.
So they have the ability to prioritize how they handle cases and how they schedule cases. They do it right now for stalking and sexual assault cases. Like
Yeah.
those get handled on an expedited basis. They do it for sort of like preliminary injunction or emergency type hearings. So, they have the ability to do it. It's just, as the judiciary pointed out, if we have to prioritize this group of cases, then other cases get
Yeah.
pushed further out.
Makes sense.
So it's always about balancing. The Senate also heard a lot of testimony about how this was going to open the floodgates for evictions, and we were going to see an unprecedented number of evictions. Um, I, I don't really know if that's accurate. I mean, people violate the lease now or don't pay their rent now, and housing providers take action based on that. So I don't think having a faster process, a housing provider is going to be like, aha, now I'm going to evict more people. Like that's not the analysis. And I think one of the challenges we see over and over again is trying to get elected officials to understand that that is not how these
Yeah.
decisions are made.
Yeah. It's not what people want to do in the housing provider. Like we
No.
don't want to. They're not in the business of evicting
No,
people.
you're
Uh,
right. You're in the
yeah.
business of providing housing for people, not having them removed from that housing. It's long, it's expensive. There's no upside to the housing provider to have to initiate that process, whether it takes 6 months, like our current process, or whether it takes 90 days.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Exactly. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the webinar, there's a Q&A tab down at the bottom. So feel free for those that are on the call, populate your questions at the end. We'll try to get through as many of them as we can. Angela, out of this bill, I mean, obviously it didn't pass,
yeah,
but it's still really, really important that we all know what was being proposed because it gained enough traction that these things are likely to come up, the next round. Uh,
yeah. And I think that that's likely. I
yeah,
think we still have a lot of interest in trying to find a path forward for fixing many of these problems.
yeah,
And the problems I'm talking about are the length of time it takes to have a problem tenant removed,
yeah,
um, both somebody that's violating the lease agreement through lease violations, but also I would argue somebody that's not paying the rent. Some folks see those two as different issues. Um, so having folks removed in a more expedited or efficient manner, um, I think is going to be a topic of discussion. There's probably going to be additional conversations with the judiciary to try to figure out, what they could get on board with to, help move something through. I think the other big piece of this bill were some changes to the no trespass statute.
Yeah.
So what we're up against right now is if you go through court and you get a writ of possession against a tenant, that writ of possession removes them from their specific unit that they were occupying. But if their neighbor in the building invites them to come visit them or to come move in with them, the landlord cannot issue a no trespass order against that's enforceable against that person, even though they've just been evicted out of the building. And this creates a lot of problems in particularly multifamily properties. It relates back to an old Vermont Supreme Court case from I think the 90s, 1990s, that the Supreme Court said, nope, if you're being invited on, a no trespass is not effective against that person. So one of the pieces to this bill was to try to fix that problem
Yeah.
and to make it clear that if a person has a no trespass or has a writ of possession that's been issued by the court against them, that the landlord can prohibit them from coming back on the property, even if they're being invited by somebody else, and that no trespasses would be effective in that sort of situation.
Would that be a, I mean, it would be for the person inviting them in, even right now, a breach of
Yeah,
lease on their side,
a
eventually, if
hundred.
they're a long-term guest.
100%. It still is a lease violation, but then you have to go through another round
Wow.
of eviction. And what we see is you evict that household and then they move into other apartments and then you evict the next household and then they move into, it's just, it's
A
kind of
lot.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
you're just chasing people through buildings sometimes. And it's not good. Not good
Yeah.
for the other residents to see this happening or have to deal with this. And then the behavior continues in the building. Usually it's because somebody's getting evicted for a specific behavior reason. Um,
Right.
Sometimes drugs, sometimes other things.
Yeah.
But
Well,
creates,
regardless, that would have been a welcome change.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah. So
yes,
hopefully that makes its way back around for sure.
yes. I mean, those are definitely two of the bigger chunks in the bill. The version that passed the House also included some changes to the definition of actual notice. So I think, as folks know, um, how you deliver your termination notices is very specific in statute. And right now it says you have to prove they received a copy of the notice.
Mhm.
And you can only accomplish that by hand delivering the notice or mailing it. And there's a presumption that the mail is received 3 days after it's sent. So, there's a variety of ways that you can try to accomplish that, but many times, if you send certified and first class, the certified comes back, so you're relying on a first class letter that maybe somebody could say they didn't get. You can pay the sheriff to deliver it. Sometimes they're able to do that in the time frame, sometimes they're not. But it becomes almost like a game. Tenants know that if we don't sign for this letter, they're going to have a harder time evicting us, or if I don't answer the door for the sheriff. And so one of the things that was in 772 was adding some additional categories of how to deliver the notice. So, like adding email delivery if it's provided for in the lease, being able to post it to the door if you also send it in the mail, being able to very make it clear that it can be served by the sheriff. There's been a few challenges by like legal aid saying sheriff service isn't like hand delivery, which is very weird. But anyway, so it was, making some adjustments to how people communicate now.
Yeah.
The big one was email,
Yeah.
because but
All very like practical changes that, everyone loves to
yes.
think on now. So yeah.
Yes, very, very practical. But, to listen to the tenant advocates talk about some of these changes, um, it's the sky is falling and tenants are going to get evicted and not know, how, maybe they don't check their email. It's like, well, they also don't open their mail. So, it's kind of, and,
Same thing.
there's ways to get read receipts and,
Right.
things like that for email.
Right.
So, we were trying to be mindful with the language around that. So it wasn't just that something would go via email. It has to go to email and a mailed copy. Like you had to do two. So, it was trying to cover those bases of making sure that the tenant received a notice that something was wrong with their
Right.
tenancy.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
but let's see. So some of the other provisions in the bill that passed the House were, and this would fall in sort of like the for tenant category, was a requirement that landlords can only increase the rent one time in a 12-month period. So it wasn't rent control, so they weren't saying how much you could raise the rent, but they were putting a time frame on how many times you could raise the rent.
Yeah.
I mean, that seemed relatively straightforward and something that when you were looking at the larger context and larger bill made sense, right? It's a balancing of people's rights and obligations.
Yeah, and for the most part, from property owners that we interact with in our practice as a company is, we try to keep up with the regular rent increases. It really becomes a problem if you don't have that rent increase process in place, and all of a sudden you
Right?
blinked and 3 or 4 years have gone by and you haven't done anything, and now you're trying to like do bite-sized small ones to kind of catch up. That obviously is not ideal for anybody. So having that good rent increase process is important. But yeah, it's always been
Correct.
our practice to do it once in a 12-month period. But I mean,
Right.
with the changing economies right now, just the rising costs, I could totally get how that would be a worry on, on the tenant advocate end of things for sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. And actually that was a request of the tenant advocate side.
Yeah.
They wanted more than that, but that was what, the compromise was for that provision. The other piece here was some changes to the application fee section. So, we've had some upheaval regarding that section for a really long period of time. It was sort of understood that a charge for a credit check or a background check was not covered under that application fee prohibition. Um, Legal Aid has taken a different position in the last like 5-ish years
Yeah.
related to that section of the statute. It's, I think, caused a lot of problems for tenants and for housing providers. So the changes to the application fee section made it clear that a housing provider could charge the actual cost for a background check or a credit check unless the applicant brought a copy of their own sort of report. So that was sort of the balancing there. So landlord, housing providers you could charge, but if a tenant says, "Here's a copy of my current credit report," you'd have to accept that in lieu of charging them for the report. So again, it's this, trying to balance rights and make things fair for everybody. A
We've
little
been
bit here, a little bit there.
Yeah, we've been trying to have, make sure we have a voice at the table through, the last 4 or 5 years through all of these proposed changes and things like
Yep.
that. And this is one that always comes up, and actually our website's been brought up a couple times in the testimony from uh other tenant advocates around,
Yeah.
hey, look, these guys are doing it. But our practice has always been we just cover the cost. It's not a profit for us. But the
Right.
piece in all these conversations that is interesting and why we want to have a voice is the property management company. It's not a very predominant industry in Vermont in the first place, but we're kind of forgotten about where it's like, yes,
Right.
property owners and tenants, those are the two parties in the picture, but there's a third party in the picture that needs to be thought about here. And for us,
Right.
the majority of our clients own one or two properties. They might screen 2 or 3 people a year, so that $20 or $30 application fee is no big deal. But for us as a
Right.
management company that runs over probably 1,000 a year, that could
Right.
be a $30,000 or $40,000 line item that you're asking us to eat. So
Right.
it's never been a profit for us, but that's
Right.
why we want to have, be at the table for these things, is because we're part of the picture too.
Right. Exactly. And there, you have slightly different views on things and different obligations and pressure points,
Right.
I think. So another aspect to 772 was limiting the amount of deposit that a housing provider could collect from a tenant to equal to 2 months worth of rent.
Mhm.
Um, you know, it, anytime we start to see changes to restrictions like this, I think there can be some unintended consequences that don't allow people to create contracts that work. Like every situation's a little unique, and sometimes people have different needs or different requirements. And so when you start to put restrictions like this, it it, for the majority of tenancies, like that kind of restriction is fine, because most folks, housing providers, property managers aren't collecting more than 2 months worth of rent for a deposit for
Right.
first or last in security. But there are some unique situations where people have had different conversations or there's an exception being made. Maybe somebody doesn't have good credit, and so the solution is a bigger security deposit, or, there's always sort of a trade-off. But in sort of, again, looking at the grand scheme, if you're like, well, 2 months and all of these changes to the eviction process, okay, we can balance that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. The question I had reading after that, and as it was being proposed, is had this bill passed, and
Hmm.
that 2 months deposit was the cap from like a state level, would that trump local municipalities that have passed regulations to only allow 1 month's rent as a
No,
deposit? No. So
no. So,
local,
because that's more restrictive.
yeah,
So anytime a local ordinance is more restrictive than what the state's requiring, the more restrictive one
exactly.
would be in effect.
Got it.
But it just would mean that any place that doesn't have a municipal restriction like that would have been subject to that 2 months
Yeah.
deposit
Yeah. And when we're talking about
collection.
those municipalities, it's really just Barry and Burlington, right? There's no other municipality.
Brattleboro.
Brattleboro too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and Barry, I don't believe has that restriction anymore.
No, they changed it a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But they
yeah.
did at one point, but they did away with it.
Yeah.
So I think it's just Burlington and Brattleboro at this point
Yeah.
have those.
I think the one that people want to know most about that are on this call is the hot
Yes.
button item, the no cause, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciated a lot of the testimony that came in from housing providers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we were one of them as well, but it trying to define that, like it's not a no cause eviction at its delivery. It's just a notice of non-renewal. And I
Right.
saw that they tried to clear that definition up, which was really nice, and it would have been a
Yeah.
welcome change for sure.
Yeah. So what happened? Let's talk about the no cause situation. So the concept here was to create a separate process. So the faster court eviction process was going to apply to like breach notices and non-payment of rent notices. But there was still going to be this, what we call now the no cause notice. But really, the essence of that notice was the landlord is terminating for some reason that's not related to the behavior of the tenant.
Right.
So it was things like the lease is just ending, the unit needs renovations, the property's being sold, the landlord wants to use the property for a family member. It does start to look like just cause to some extent, but the list still included leases ending.
Yeah.
Um, so it's still inherently a no cause notice.
Right.
Without fault notice is maybe a better way to describe it or look at it. And so what the statute or what this change would have done was to make that as a category
Yeah.
with one notice time frame of 90 days. So
Yeah.
we weren't in this weird matrix of, do you have a written lease? Do you not have a written lease? How long have you lived there? Is it for this weird little sale of building subset that's maybe 30 days? Maybe you can't use this, maybe you can use it. It was just a blanket 90-day. If you're using a notice for something that's not a lease violation or a non-payment of rent situation.
Yeah.
And so one of the negatives about this bill was if the housing provider used that notice, so that new 90-day notice that covered all of these other reasons, halfway through that notice period, they needed to refund a portion of the security deposit to the tenant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, so that was, I'll be upfront with you guys. I was not happy about that
Yeah,
because I think we all can see, tenant gets that notice, they stop paying rent. Now there's a deficiency. Now I have to give money back. Like, how is this fair? How does this work? But again, this is all part of a compromise. And so you have to look at the whole, like, is do all of the other benefits outweigh these pieces?
right.
And it's not easy. And, some days it's just, you're like, I don't know. Like, is this going to cause chaos? Like, I don't know if this is going to cause chaos. But again, it's part of that balancing. Like, okay, you're going to use this notice, and you guys say that, there's no reason when you use this notice. So we're going to give the tenant the benefit of the doubt. But we're going to
Right.
give you this faster process. So if there really is a problem, you should use that process to
Right.
to remove your tenant.
Yeah, they had me until that piece right there where
Yeah,
I was like, this is reading like a no con, but really, again,
right,
we're just choosing not to renew your lease. It's
right,
not an eviction at that point in time. It's just saying,
right,
hey, your lease is running out in 90 days. We're choosing not to renew you. And you had to check one of the 8 boxes, which for the most part in
right,
our world, when we're using it the right way, it's because we want to do larger renovations or
right.
make big improvements or something.
Correct.
So,
And so I think, one of the pieces of conversation that I'm going to be having going forward with folks is, look, that's fine, and we don't mind sending half of the deposit back as long as there's not like a rent delinquency.
yeah.
So we're happy to do this, but the rent needs to be current for us to be able to send this money over. And if it's not, then we don't have to do that because now you've told us we have to choose
Well,
between the
or
rent getting
damages in
paid,
general.
right? Damage in
Right?
general, if you know that there's damages, right? And so I think there's some places where language can be finessed a little bit to make that more fair for both parties.
Yeah.
And the other piece about that catch-all sort of no fault, I'm just going to start calling it a no fault notice because I don't really know what else to call it at this point. Was it had to go through the regular eviction process, so the process that we have now. So
Yes.
it wasn't going to be on this expedited track.
Yeah.
It was going to be sort of business as normal
Yeah.
for what we have right now. Because again, if a person hasn't moved out, you've indicated it's not because of the behavior of the tenant, it's for one of these other reasons.
Right. And where the no cause the way it is now comes into play a lot is because these other avenues haven't worked as
Right,
fast as supposed to. So if there
right,
was a streamlined process, yeah, I think property owners might be willing to give a little on that if they knew in fact that if they were to execute and try to pursue a quicker non-payment or breach of lease, it was actually going to result in something, right? But that's been
right.
the biggest holdup.
Right, and that's been the challenge. And I
Right.
will say, so the other piece to this as part of the speeding up of the process is the notice timeframes for those types of notices also shrunk.
Yeah,
So
the
the
non-payment was
non-payment
10 days.
was to 10 days. The violation notice for sort of like a standard violation was, hang on, I just want to make sure I give the right timing because it changed
I think it
so
was
much.
I think it was 20 days was what it was.
Yeah, it was short. Um, Much shorter than it had been. Hang on, I just got off into the wrong section here. So for breach,
21 days, I think.
21 days.
Yeah.
Yep. And then like there was also for the um, violent damage to the building or other activity which threatens the health and safety of other residents,
Yeah.
landlord or landlord's agent, or neighbors, right? So we expanded
Yeah.
that definition to include some other people.
Yeah.
That termination notice was 5 days.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of big changes.
Yeah. So, it was so from both the notice time frame and the court process for those like violation behavior related things, the process was really going to speed up, and be a lot more streamlined,
Yeah.
than it had been, but way more in line with what our neighboring states have for
Yeah.
process as well.
So just to recap that for everyone, we had, there's a lot in there. So we have the basically a breach of lease, but for violent actions that impacted the building, residents, and neighbors, got compressed down to 5 days, which now it's
Mhm.
like
14.
14. Yep. So down to
And
five.
and and it only is threatens the health and safety of other residents.
Right. Right. Now it's
Yeah.
neighbor too, which is good.
Neighbors and
Yeah.
the landlord or landlord's agent, so
Yeah.
property manager. So if a tenant, somebody's threatening you guys, you
Yeah.
could use that shorter notice.
Yeah. That was, I brought that up in one of our 1 year during one of our testimonies that we gave, where it's like it's threats of life happen, and it's like that's
Mhm.
the point where that no cause comes out, because it's like that just not worth it, you know. But
Right.
all right, so we had the violent acts went down to 5 days. Breach of
Hmm.
lease in general for lease violations went
Just general like smoking or,
yeah,
things that were the non-violent behavior went from 30 to 21 days.
21. Non-payment went from 14 to
14 to
10, although
10.
courts are still kind of enforcing this 30-day.
So the 30-day CARES is still in effect.
Yeah,
Their HUD isn't just wrapped up a rule making to remove that provision completely. The comment period closed for that. They have to
yeah,
go through all the comments and
yeah,
respond to them. But we're headed towards that 30-day CARES stuff being removed from
yeah,
our processes, which will help as well.
yeah, good. And then the no no fault is what you
The no,
refer to it as, had
yeah, no
a lot
fault.
of parameters in it, but one of them was just the lease is ending and you can choose not to renew it. So, uh,
Exactly.
so what
Exactly.
was the biggest pushback from the housing, the tenant advocates that
Right.
ultimately like made this thing fail?
Well, you hear a lot of it's going to cause more evictions.
Yeah,
Tenants aren't, it's going to increase homelessness.
yeah,
People aren't going to have a place to go. They don't have the resources to defend themselves. And if the process is sped up, they can't get in touch with advocates. Um, there's this sense that housing providers send these types of notices improperly, that the tenant's not actually violating the lease.
yeah.
Look, I'm sure there's probably a case out there where that was true.
Yeah,
But if a housing provider is using a lease violation notice right now, there's a problem.
yeah, of course there is.
There's a
Yeah,
problem
yeah.
that needs to be fixed. That is not
Especially,
compatible with the other residents in the building, right? That's also the problem.
yeah,
So,
especially right now. Like our last webinar we did was, how to underwrite a project and underwrite a property, and like
mhm,
the expense end of things is just such a moving target right now. It's so hard to
yeah,
control. The only thing you can control is the income side. So housing providers don't want the turnover. They want the retention, and they want good people,
right,
and they want even people that are a little rough around the edges, but they're willing to work with them as much as they can. Like that has always been the goal. So
right.
yeah,
It ex exactly. And I've been in these sort of sessions before, and we do a lot of informal polls because we don't have a way to really reach large numbers of folks. I mean,
yeah,
we do, but sometimes this captive audience is like the best because you can just ask people to raise their hands or just
right.
indicate. Um, and w- I have in the last year or so, asked larger groups of housing providers if you knew you could remove somebody in 60 days or less, would you be more willing to rent to folks that maybe didn't meet all of your normal criteria? And the answer almost across the board is yes.
Sure.
Yes.
99% of the times, yes. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah,
And the biggest detriment to people finding housing right now is this protracted removal process
yeah,
that makes it very hard for um, tenants to find housing because landlords are being very choosy with who they rent to because it's a risk management
exactly.
issue
Yeah,
for
exactly.
sure.
There was another big piece that came out of this, or almost came out of the bill, around um, more of like a pilot program around a credit builder program. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because we've begun to implement that within our company just to kind of get ahead of the eight ball. But yeah, where we're reporting positive rent payments to the credit bureaus, and uh, is this something that you see sticking around and being required? And is it gonna have to be administered at a state level, or are we gonna be able to partner with third party applications like we do now?
So that particular, so it was the positive rental payment credit reporting pilot,
Yeah.
because we have to do everything with lots of words.
Yeah.
Um,
And pilot's
s-
gotta be in
right? So it was tasking the state treasurer with
there.
creating this program
Yeah.
for positive rent payments to then send out to credid reporting agencies. Um, so I think the problem is if it would have passed, like the state treasurer would have taken this framework and then had to do some rulemaking to create the program. And then it was a pilot for, I think it was 2 years maybe. And so, how it would actually look, what it would actually look like, is we're hard to say. But the treasurer could have contracted out to a third party, so it probably would have been with some other entity that would have been running sort of that particular program. But it was going to be a way for tenants to build credit for on-time rent payments,
Yeah.
which sort of, helps across the board with getting better rates for vehicles and for credit cards and potentially buying their own real estate, because there's no way to sort of build that credit right now unless, your property management company
Yeah.
does those positive rent payments, which I know there are programs out there that offer that service.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Well, if
yeah.
there's how do as we kind of wind down the webinar here, for when all this comes back up, because it's gonna come back up.
I kind of hope so, right? Like
Yeah.
I think we need that, right? Like
Yeah,
we
there's some tweaks that need to be made, of course, to make it
yeah,
really good. You brought up a
right.
couple that are a little questioning and a little worrisome, but
Yeah,
how can folks be a part of the equation? How can they have a voice? How can they make sure that proper changes are being implemented and that they have a chance to influence what's happening?
right. I mean, as always, reaching out and having these conversations with your elected officials.
Yeah,
So your state representatives, your state senators, those are the folks to have these conversations with and to ask them about this particular bill and to ask them, did you support or not support? You can actually find that information on the legislator's website,
yeah,
legislative website. Um, and if, they didn't support, like in the House, if they didn't support this bill, the question is why? And then share some of your stories, your personal stories about what it's like being a housing provider. What are the challenges that you're facing?
yeah,
What are the pressures? What is it like to manage a building where one unit is dealing drugs and causing sort of chaos in the building, and what is it like to manage all of those other units that are now scared, don't want to go outside, can't use the common areas, they basically get chased out of the places in that building that they should be allowed to be using because they don't feel safe or they don't they're worried, and so I think that's part of what we've seen shift the tide a little bit, is that the the elected officials are hearing from folks, and they're hearing not the like angry, tenants are terrible and we want to be able to throw them out with no notice or whatever, but it's like this is the impact, and this is the impact that it has on my business, but if you take it one step further, this is the impact it has on other tenants.
yeah,
This is why we're concerned, because we see other residents in our buildings being impacted. We see that it's harder for tenants to find places to go
yeah,
because housing providers can't take a risk because the removal process is so long and
yeah,
complicated. Um, and I think the more they hear that, some are never going to come around. Just going to tell you that.
yeah,
Some, but they will. Some of them are listening, and we need more of them listening. So, these are questions to be asking as people are running for office. Where do they stand on housing? Were they aware of this housing bill? What are their thoughts on it? It can give you a good sense of who they are and maybe how they would vote if they got elected.
right. And you hit the nail on the head. People are going to hear the message if it's delivered in in articulated in a nice presentable way that is tied to the bigger, broader problem, not
Right.
to the I always cringe every time I watch and any of the testimony and I hear, housing providers throwing around the words like scumbag renters and deadbeat rent. It just falls on deaf ears, and that's not the message they're trying to
Right.
deliver, but it goes nowhere.
And I think the flip side of this is for those housing providers, if you have um, good relationships with the renters in your buildings,
Yeah,
if you have renters that can add their voice to
yeah,
this,
yeah,
that also is going to help move the needle,
yeah,
right? So the renters who live in these situations, if they can provide that information, they're willing to send an email, they're willing to come in and testify in committee about what it's like to live for months
right,
next to somebody that's
right,
causing problems in their building, that also can get some traction.
yeah.
And I think a even better response than hearing from housing providers.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. Agree with you.
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna open it up a little bit for some questions. If there's any lingering questions out there, Mark, if you don't mind helping me, are you able to view the Q&A on your side? Good.
Yeah, there's a couple that came in. So first off,
Okay.
thank you, Angela and Ruben, for running
Yeah.
this. This is great. First question was in regards to accepting a credit report and background check from an applicant in lieu of charging any background credit check fee. Could the applicant provide just any credit report, i.e., Credit Karma, Experian, etc., or would we be able to allow them to provide their own from the same company that we use to pull credit?
So the the proposed language in the statute didn't actually provide any of that information. So, what we know about people's ability to pull credit reports is that an individual has the ability to get a free credit report once every 12 months from each of the three main credit reporting agencies. So that's Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. So there's only three. So even something like Credit Karma is pulling from one of those three companies. So I think the presumption was that the report was coming from one of those three companies because that's who would provide them, and that it has to be dated within 90 days prior to within 90 days of the application date. So it has to be relatively recent. I think the original bill said 30 days, and I think the 90 days was some tenant advocacy like pushback. So it wasn't like, here's my credit report from a year ago. It had to be something a little more contemporaneous. But no, there was not something where you could I mean, I suppose it doesn't say you couldn't require that they get it from a specific company, but there are only three. So, the third chance of getting it from the one. Or you could make a suggestion, if the tenant said, hey, I don't want to pay this fee, be like, well, here's where you can get your
Right.
credit report from Experian.
Yeah. Part
So,
of part of when we wrote in trying to provide our voice around that topic was, AI is becoming it is a very real thing, and people can
yeah,
like make fake credit reports, and it's a real like application fraud in rental housing across the country is really
yeah,
becoming a big problem. And there's a lot of noise out there right now around it. So we definitely push back on that. Like,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, no, and I don't disagree. I mean, even before the rise of AI, I had seen
yeah,
some doctored
yeah,
uh, credit reports from folks. So it is possible. I mean, you can change PDFs. People are more tech savvy,
we've
and
had
sometimes it's harder to tell. But
yeah.
yeah.
We obviously work with a great bank, and we've had our bank call us a couple times and say, "Hey, I have someone here trying to deposit one of your checks. Is this
Mm,
legitimately your check?" And they mail you a copy of it. It looks
yeah,
identical to your checks, but it's not one of your check numbers. So it's just
yeah,
it's amazing what you can create out there.
yeah. I mean, I think we're going to see it with, rental applications and reference letters and like
Right.
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wait, I was
One
gonna
of the,
say, wait till the wave of, claims that those photos you took after the tenant moved out and destroyed the unit isn't actually accurate. Because
Yeah,
here's my AI doctored photo showing, what it looked like when I moved out, and it was in perfect condition.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how we're gonna navigate. Like, who's gonna be right? How do you prove that you're right?
Right, right.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Just two quick ones for you, Angela. So
Yeah.
the comment earlier around a sheriff, being deemed not hand delivered. If that's the case, then what would be considered hand delivered?
I know, right?
Yeah.
um there some sheriff's offices will do the practice of if they can't get the tenant in hand, they'll just tack it to the door.
Right.
At the termination notice phase, like if it's a court process, you have to get a specific order for that. So this was to some extent an attempt to allow that, right? Because that's still delivered by sheriff's service, technically. So it you could still hand deliver, but it just created sort of a new category that helps us navigate some of these tenant challenges. So the hand delivery was still there. So as hand delivery delivered by sheriff's service, which if the sheriff deemed it good service, i.e. tacking it to the door, then that would have qualified under the statute.
Got it. Yeah, and then just one final one is, can you just give a like 50,000 foot view of the process of when a bill is introduced to actually being completed and stamped, approved? Because
Sure.
like I think everyone has an idea of it, but just from your point of view on that entire process.
Sure. So they'll take this, not this particular bill, but sort of the track that this bill took. So it gets introduced in one half of the legislature. So bill gets introduced in the House. It immediately, depending on what the subject of that bill is, gets referred to a committee. There's committees that cover every sort of topic from environmental to infrastructure to appropriations, judiciary, like they're sort of experts in their subject matter. So a bill gets referred to that committee, and that committee is the one that takes testimony, decides which bills get moved forward, which ones they're going to take votes on. So in committee, that's where there's opportunities for testimony if a bill is being moved ahead. It's also possible for a bill to move through two or three different committees, depending on what's in the bill. So it goes into committee one. So in this case, the House General and Housing Committee. There's discussion, there's testimony. Sometimes, a lot of times, there's changes to the bill based on testimony and information. Then that committee votes, and they vote out a version of the bill that they're confident with or happy with or can live with. Then that bill can go to another committee if there's other things in there. And so that same process happens again. When it's done with committees, then it goes to the vote for the whole House. So it goes to what's called the floor of the House. And so that's when the whole House of Representatives votes on whether that bill is going to pass or not. Vote out of the House. And so there can be, people can make what are called floor amendments to make changes on the fly. Like there's, it's not just as simple as like, yes, we vote yay and we vote nay, but that's what eventually happens. So there's a yes or no vote. If that bill, the House says no, that bill's done. So, the Senate could take up its own version, but that House bill is done. If the vote is yes on the floor of the House, then the bill moves to the Senate and the exact same thing happens. So it goes into a Senate committee. The Senate committee starts tinkering with it, taking testimony, looking at it, and that Senate committee passes it out, and maybe it goes to another committee, but eventually it goes to the floor of the Senate for a vote. If what the Senate passes looks different from what the House passes, then they have to have a little conference to figure out what version we're going to use or if there's something in the middle. Sometimes the House will pass a bill, it'll go over to the Senate, they'll pass what the House passed. And if that happens, so it passes the House, then it passes the Senate, then it goes to the governor for a signature. So at that point, the governor can sign the bill. The governor can allow the bill to become law without his signature, or the governor can veto the bill. So those are sort of the three options. Um, signs the bill or lets it become law without signature, then fine. Then the bill becomes effective depending on what all bills have dates for when it's going to start. If the governor vetoes that bill, then the bill can go back to the legislature for the legislature, both the House and the Senate, then have to re-vote to override the veto. And there's really high thresholds for being able to do that. So it can be a very long ride for a bill from start to finish, with a lot of opportunities for changes, a lot of opportunities for it to like sort of bump off the road, for things to get added to it or changed to it that makes it not palatable, right? So I think if we're looking specifically at 772, 772 that came out of the House was palatable. It had positives and negatives in there, but when you looked at it as a whole, you were like, okay, this is a step in the right direction as a whole. And with all of the things in here, we can work with this. Then the Senate got a hold of it, started stripping stuff out, started changing stuff, and it wasn't the same bill anymore. And so what they ended up voting on the Senate floor was so far removed from what we had. It's not a bad thing that it did not progress further, because it just was so different than what the House had sent over.
So all that to say that what was created in the House and is gonna come back up next round for
Yeah,
sure, because they've already done a lot of the legwork and hopefully they tweak and refine and build off of that. So,
yes,
and it's been
yes,
compounding for a couple of years now too.
it has. And look, I will say that when the bill got over to the Senate Judiciary for a period of time was working really hard on this bill and had recrafted some of the court process language that was actually, in my opinion, better than what the House passed.
right.
Right. So there was a period in time where you're like, okay, this is great. They're working on this. They're making this. They're catching some things that, we missed over in the House. They're clarifying some things. They're making it that's going to work better. And then that just kind of died in committee, right? So there is some language out there that I think that we can pull from some of these amendments that various people tried to help make this the best bill that it could be.
Right. Well, we really
Yeah.
appreciate your time today, Angela. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for having me.
If it's okay, in our follow-up emails to people that were on, share your information in case they have follow-up questions or want to get a hold of you
Sure,
for any
that's fine.
reason.
I'd say email is the best way to get a hold of me.
I got you.
Um, yeah.
Yep, happy to do that. Well, appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much. We'll email this recording around to folks and feel free to circulate it around your network as well, okay?
All right. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Angela.